Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You guys sent us some pretty intense materials. Looks like we're diving into the world of blackout survival today.
Blackout survival.
Yeah, so we're looking at this program called
Okay.
Operation Blackout, How to Survive 365 Days of Darkness.
365 days of darkness.
This isn't your typical prepper manual, though, right? This is like a deeply personal plea.
Yeah, it feels much more personal. It's almost like a letter from a concerned friend who also happens to be a combat vet.
Right, and that's Teddy Daniels, right?
Yeah,
So let's talk about Teddy Daniels for a minute. This guy's got quite the background.
quite a background.
I mean, U.S. Army combat veteran, Purple Heart recipient,
Wow.
former police officer. He was even a political candidate at one point.
Yeah, he's definitely someone who's dedicated his life to service and really facing danger head on. He even talks about being shot while serving in Afghanistan and how that near-death experience and his faith really shaped his worldview. That's intense. So he basically feels like he's been given this mission to warn others about potential threats. And in this case, it's a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse attack.
HEMP attack.
Right. So basically what he believes is that countries like Russia or China could detonate a nuclear weapon high in the atmosphere, which creates an EMP that would essentially fry electronics across the entire U.S.
The thing is, a HEMP attack is silent and invisible, making it extremely difficult to trace back to whoever did it.
Right, and that obviously complicates things. So Daniels believes a HEMP attack could cripple our power grid,
Our power grid.
leading to a blackout that could last for an entire year.
Wow.
And that's where those 365 days of darkness come in. He paints a pretty vivid picture of what that would look like.
He does, and he cites a report from the Congressional Advisory Board to support this. It's important to mention that this report presents a worst-case scenario, but it does suggest that a nationwide blackout of that length could lead to a complete societal collapse and a 90% mortality rate.
Wow, that's a pretty bleak picture. No communication.
No communication?
No transportation, no access to basic necessities.
It's really back to basics in a way that most of us have never even considered.
Right, he's talking about cell phones going dead, internet and radio communications failing,
Cars stalling,
planes dropping out of the sky,
supply chains collapsing.
and of course, widespread social unrest and violence.
Yeah. It's basically highlighting how vulnerable we are with our reliance on technology.
Mm.
I mean, if something like this were to happen.
This scenario, even if it's extreme, really brings up that interconnectedness of modern society
Absolutely.
and those vulnerabilities that we face. What do you think is the most concerning aspect of this? I mean, if the power grid went down for a year.
Well, I think it's got to be that potential for widespread panic and social breakdown. Imagine a world where you can't communicate with your loved ones. Grocery stores are empty. Basic services like the police and healthcare are overwhelmed. It's pretty much a recipe for chaos.
Yeah, for sure. And Daniels uses a recent event to illustrate just how possible a HEMP attack against the U.S. really could be. That Nord Stream pipeline bombing,
Oh, right.
that was a pretty major international incident, obviously, with a lot of conflicting information floating around, a lot of accusation.
Yeah, a lot of finger pointing for sure.
But Daniels firmly believes that the U.S. was responsible,
Really.
based on information from sources like Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh.
Okay.
And this is a significant claim because it ties into his belief that the U.S. is actually provoking Russia, maybe even pushing them towards more drastic measures.
So essentially, he's saying we might be the bad guys in this situation.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, he's very critical of U.S. involvement in the Ukraine conflict.
The Ukraine conflict.
Right. He believes all that aid and those weapons that we're sending to Ukraine are just escalating the situation.
Okay.
And he argues that actions like that, along with some pretty strong rhetoric coming from U.S. leaders, could be pushing Russia to a point where they feel like a HEMP attack is their only option.
So he's painting a picture of a cornered animal, basically, that could lash out.
Right, and he connects this to Russia's warnings about catastrophic consequences,
Right.
and even Putin's statements about fighting for Russia's existence.
I mean, those are some pretty strong words.
They are, so he's painting this picture of a cornered bear, which could lash out in some pretty unpredictable and dangerous ways.
I mean, that definitely raises some serious questions about the whole situation. Are we headed down a path towards more conflict? It's a pretty provocative perspective.
It is. We've got this very urgent warning from a guy with a compelling background, but we've also got this very complex and potentially volatile situation going on in the world. It definitely feels like there's more to unpack here.
Oh, absolutely. We've only just scratched the surface of Operation Blackout and the claims Daniels is making. Next, we need to take a closer look at the evidence and see how it stacks up against other viewpoints. Are his claims about Russia's motive and capabilities really credible? And what about the solutions he proposes? How plausible are those?
We'll tackle all of that and more in part 2 of this deep dive.
Can't wait.
Stay with us.
All right, so let's dig a little deeper into the claims behind Operation Blackout.
Okay.
Daniels paints a pretty dramatic picture of this potential HEMP attack and all the consequences.
Yeah.
But what evidence does he actually offer to back all that up?
Well, he really leans on that Congressional Advisory Board report that we talked about earlier.
Right.
You know, the one that predicts a massive death toll if the power grid goes down for a whole year.
A whole year.
Yeah, he brings up that 90% mortality statistic a lot to really drive home that sense of urgency.
That's definitely attention-grabbing.
Yeah.
But it is important to remember that report is a worst-case scenario, and there are different opinions out there about how likely a HEMP attack actually is and what the real impact would be.
So you're saying some experts might think Daniels is exaggerating the threat a little bit?
It's definitely possible. Some experts argue that a HEMP could cause some disruptions to the power grid, but the effects might be more localized and less catastrophic than what Daniels is suggesting. They point to the fact that our power grid is actually pretty resilient, and there are people working to harden it against those kinds of attacks.
Daniels does mention those efforts, but he doesn't seem too convinced.
I see.
He's pretty critical of the current administration, and he claims that the focus on what he calls woke agendas has distracted our military and left us unprepared.
So that's where his personal opinions and political leanings start to come into play.
Right, and he ties that back to the Nord Stream pipeline incident, saying that it was a reckless provocation that's basically made the U.S. a target for retaliation.
Retaliation.
Yeah, possibly even in the form of a HEMP attack.
So he's essentially saying that the U.S. is the aggressor here, responsible for escalating tensions with Russia to the point where they might feel like a HEMP attack is their only option.
Yeah, it's a controversial stance, for sure.
Very much so.
And then he goes on to say that the mainstream media is ignoring this threat.
Oh, boy.
And that big tech might even censor him for speaking out.
Well, that's a pretty classic conspiracy theory tactic.
Yeah, it's definitely meant to appeal to a certain audience.
Right, people who already distrust official sources and are looking for alternative explanations for things.
It's that whole us versus them mentality.
Exactly, with Daniels positioning himself as the one with the truth that everyone's trying to suppress.
Yeah, and it can be pretty persuasive.
It can.
Especially for people who feel like they're not being heard or that they're being lied to.
Definitely.
But it's important to be critical about these claims, not just take them at face value.
Absolutely. We always need to be careful about who we trust and what information we're consuming.
So how do we separate fact from fiction here?
It's tough. Daniels is blending legitimate concerns about grid security with some pretty strong political opinions and maybe even a bit of fear-mongering.
Right, so it's not just a neutral presentation of the facts.
No, it's colored by his own beliefs and his agenda.
And that makes it hard to look at the information objectively.
It does.
He does cite some interesting sources, though.
Okay, like what?
Like that Seymour Hersh article alleging U.S. involvement in the Nord Stream pipeline bombing.
Oh, right.
Hersh won a Pulitzer Prize for his journalism, so that adds some weight to what Daniels is saying, doesn't it?
Well, Hersh is a respected journalist, but his work has also been criticized over the years. And that Nord Stream article in particular has been challenged by some other journalists and government officials.
Okay, so it's not necessarily proof of anything.
It's just one perspective among many, and we have to weigh that against all the other information that's out there.
It's important to see the big picture.
It is.
We can't just assume that everything Daniels says is the gospel truth, even if he does name drop some important people and reference these official-sounding reports.
Critical thinking is key. We always have to examine the sources, look for potential biases, evaluate the logic of the arguments.
Okay, so we've got this mix of facts, opinions, and maybe some speculation. What's the takeaway for the listener? Should they be stocking up on canned goods and digging a bunker in their backyard?
I don't think it needs to be that extreme. But I do think awareness is key.
Awareness.
Yeah. Daniels, whether you agree with him or not, he brings up some important questions about how vulnerable our infrastructure is and what could happen if there was a major disruption.
He makes you think about those what-ifs.
Exactly. What if the power grid went down for a long period of time? What if those worst-case scenarios he's talking about actually happened?
What if?
And those what-if questions can motivate people to start thinking about preparing themselves.
You get ready.
Even in small ways. You know, having a plan, knowing what resources you might need, building some resilience into your everyday life.
It's not about living in fear.
No.
It's about being prepared.
Right. And it sounds like he's speaking to people who don't trust the government or traditional institutions to take care of them if something bad happens.
It's a very self-reliant approach.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about the claims and the context behind them.
Yeah.
But what about the actual survival strategies that Daniels proposes?
Right.
Are those legitimate or is it all hype?
Well, that's where things start to get a little tricky. He talks about all these elite survival techniques that he claims can help you get through 365 days of darkness.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed to be a complete guide to preparing for a long-term blackout, with tips on everything you can think of, from securing food and water to protecting your electronics from an EMP.
Okay.
But when you look closer, he's pretty vague on the details.
I did notice that.
Like, he emphasizes having a portable, renewable energy source.
Right. He talks about this military technology that's small but reliable.
But he never actually says what it is.
Right. It's like he's dangling this amazing secret in front of you, but he's not giving you the whole story.
Exactly, and that's a common tactic to make you feel like you're getting access to exclusive information that most people don't have.
To get you to buy his program.
Exactly.
And he does the same thing with that squid-like device for protecting your electronics.
What is that?
He claims it's this thing you can install on your breaker box, and it'll shield your appliances from an EMP surge.
Interesting.
But again, no real details on how it works or where you can get one.
Sounds a little fishy to me.
Right.
But if we think critically about this, based on what technology is already out there, he could be talking about commercially available surge protectors that are designed to handle EMPs.
Okay, so those do exist.
They do, and they work by using things like gas discharge tubes and metal oxide varistors to basically divert that excess voltage away from your electronics and keep them safe.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What about that Air Force One trick he mentions for protecting computers and cell phones?
What's that?
He made it sound pretty high-tech, like something only a select few people know about.
Did he really?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out the trick is just building a Faraday cage.
A Faraday cage?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty simple concept.
What is it?
Basically, you create a conductive enclosure that blocks electromagnetic fields,
Okay.
and you can actually build one yourself using things you probably already have at home,
Like what?
like a metal trash can or an ammo box lined with aluminum foil.
So it's not some secret military technology then?
Yeah, not at all. It's a valid technique for EMP protection, but it's been public knowledge for a long time.
It seems like a lot of what Daniels is offering is common sense preparedness advice mixed with a lot of hype.
It does seem that way.
He throws in some real information, but he also plays up the threat and makes these vague promises to keep people hooked.
It's a good marketing strategy, I'll give him that.
Yeah, he's definitely appealing to people's fears and anxieties.
Definitely.
He also really pushes that self-reliance thing, though,
Self-reliance.
urging people to learn things like gardening and home defense and to stockpile essential supplies like food, water, medicine.
Yeah.
And even though he might be using those recommendations to sell his program,
Right.
those are actually good pieces of advice.
They are.
No matter what you believe about a potential HEMP attack.
Being prepared for any kind of emergency is never a bad idea.
It's about taking responsibility for your own safety and well-being.
Right, and not expecting someone else to take care of you if things go wrong.
Okay, so we've explored his claims, the evidence he presents, the whole geopolitical context, even some practical survival tips. But we haven't really gotten into the details of his Operation Blackout program yet.
Right, we haven't seen what's behind the curtain.
Exactly. Does he actually deliver on those promises of revealing all these elite survival techniques?
Yeah, and is there real actionable information in there that people can use to get prepared?
That's what we need to find out.
Let's do it.
So stick with us. We'll be back in just a minute to uncover the truth behind Operation Blackout and see if it's really worth the investment. Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Operation Blackout.
Ready when you are.
We've covered so much ground already.
We have.
Daniels' background, his concerns about a potential HEMP attack, the Nord Stream incident, and even some basic survival tips.
It's been quite the journey.
It has. But now we need to get to the heart of it all.
Right, to the meat and potatoes.
What exactly is Daniels offering in this Operation Blackout program?
Well, he claims to reveal all kinds of elite survival techniques.
Yeah.
You know, things that will supposedly help you get through a whole year of darkness.
365 days.
Exactly.
It's supposed to be like this complete guide to prepping for a long-term blackout with tips on everything from finding food and water to protecting your electronics from an EMP.
A lot to cover.
It is. And one of the things he keeps talking about is having a portable, renewable energy source.
Right.
He mentions some technology that the military uses that's supposed to be really reliable and compact,
Okay.
but he's kind of vague on the details.
He is. He hints at this amazing off-grid power solution, but he never really tells you what it is.
Yeah, it's like he's trying to make it sound super secret
It's definitely a way to create that sense of intrigue.
to make you want to buy the program.
Exactly.
He does the same thing with that squid-like device for protecting electronics.
Oh yeah, what was that all about?
He claims you can hook it up to your breaker box and it'll protect all your appliances from an EMP. But again, no real explanation of how it works or where to get one.
Right.
So it makes you wonder what he's actually talking about.
Well, based on what we already know about EMP protection technology,
Uh-huh.
it's possible he's just referring to surge protectors that are designed to handle EMPs.
So those actually exist.
They do. You can buy them commercially.
Okay, so it's not some secret invention
Nope. It's just existing technology that he's dressing up with this fancy name.
to make it sound more appealing.
Exactly.
And then there's that Air Force One trick he mentioned.
The trick.
Yeah, for protecting computers and cell phones.
Right. He made it sound like something only a select few people know about.
Exactly.
But if you remember what we talked about earlier,
Uh-huh.
the trick is basically just making a Faraday cage.
A Faraday cage.
It's a pretty simple concept, really.
Mm-hmm.
You just create a conductive enclosure that blocks those electromagnetic fields.
And you can make those at home.
You can. It's not something you need special access to or anything like that.
So again, it's existing knowledge that he's presenting as this big secret.
Yeah, it's a pattern we've noticed.
It is. A lot of what he's offering is just common sense preparedness advice, but he's really hyping it up.
He is. He's inflating the threat.
Right.
And he's making these vague promises to keep people interested.
It's all about selling that program.
It seems that way.
But I will say he does emphasize self-reliance.
Self-reliance.
You know, he wants people to learn how to do things like gardening and home defense.
Right. And to stockpile supplies.
Exactly. And even though he might be using those recommendations as a marketing tactic, those are actually pretty solid pieces of advice.
They are.
No matter what you believe about this HEMP attack threat.
Being prepared for any kind of emergency is a good idea.
Right. It's all about taking responsibility for your own well-being.
And not assuming someone else is going to save you.
Exactly.
So I think that's a valuable takeaway for everyone listening.
I agree.
It's not about living in fear or panicking.
Right.
It's about being informed and being proactive.
About taking control of your own preparedness.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, you have to decide for yourself how much weight you want to give to Daniels' claims and recommendations.
We've given you the information.
The context, the different perspectives.
Now it's up to you to decide what to do with it.
Don't forget to think critically.
Always.
Do your own research.
Absolutely.
Evaluate the sources. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Question everything.
And most importantly, don't let fear be your only guide.
That's so important.
Preparedness can be empowering,
It can.
but it shouldn't come at the cost of your peace of mind.
Well said.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into Operation Blackout.
It's been a fascinating one.
It has.